Emily, I'm glad to finally meet you. I'm glad to finally get to talk to you about your book, Funeral for Flaca. Um, I read the book and I'm so excited to be here. It feels like I'm gonna sit down to get into some chisme with you. But first off, you were just mentioning this before we went live about the title for the book, and I wanted to uh, get into that first. Funeral for Flaca. Tell me about the title. Why Funeral for Flaca? El Dia de los Muertos just passed, and I was thinking about that. And as I understand, Flaca is un apodo, a former nickname. So why put it to rest?
Yeah, thank you so much again for joining me in conversation, for reading the book, and to everyone who is being present here. I know there's been a lot of Zoom happening in our lives lately, and I just really appreciative that you have taken a moment to be on Zoom with us because I know that there's a lot of other things that you could do in life. And so actually, yeah, the title is Funeral for Flaca, and while the fiery coffin is obviously the cover, on the back is actually an ofrenda. So I was thinking a lot about Dia de Muertos when I was collaborating with the artist who made this cover for me, Francisco Morales. And Funeral for Flaca is one of the essays that I ended up writing. It's now titled La Llorona in the collection. Each of the essays in this collection is actually titled after a song. And so I knew that I wanted to write about my relationship to Flaca, which was my nickname growing up, and the complexity of what it was like to realize and recognize that that name was no longer being given to me or called to me. And it's sort of a mixture of, the hardship of relationship with my father and sort of that feeling like it was severed when that nickname was no longer given. And then at the same time, it was also a mixture of being something that for me as a person who has had an eating disorder, it got muddied in both of those. And so I wanted to write about that, and this vision of a funeral sort of came to me as I was writing. I didn't intend to necessarily imagine a funeral, but it came to me through the writing. And when I think about funerals and laying things to rest, and especially in light of Dia de Muertos, often our relationships to things that have been laid to rest can change and evolve over time. And so I wanted to make space for sort of the rebirth of myself, in a sense, if I laid this connection to rest a bit and not sever it and forget about it, right? We don't forget about the dead when they are no longer with us in this life on this plane, but we can shift the way that we think about them.
Totally, yeah. And you said so much, and I'm like, oh, where do I take this interview? Because there's so many questions that I have, and so many directions that we can go, right? Your book is super textured. There's so much of you in it. There's so many, I don't know, you use terms such as secrets and things like that throughout your book. But you just mentioned the songs. Every chapter, every essay is titled after a song. How did you pick the songs for the chapters? I mean, are these songs that you listened to while you were writing? I mean, I'm so curious.
Yeah, so when I was creating this book, I was actually in a creative writing workshop. It's called the Independent Publishing Resource Center in Portland, Oregon. And part of our work was to explore prose writing, and it was like really supportive and just encouraging of exploring writing. And in this workshop, I ended up what I call cultivating seeds, which I'll get to also later in the writing workshop. But basically, I had these sort of like little vignettes or moments and memories that I had jotted down at some point in different writing workshops. And then I suddenly had the time and space to flesh them out further. And one of the first essays that I ended up writing was the essay that is called Keep Your Head Up. And that is a song by Tupac Shakur. And I attribute that song pretty blatantly to being able to survive and feel like I had someone on my side during a time in middle school when I didn't feel like I was supported or seen, or I didn't feel strong. And it was a sort of beacon that helped me through that time. And when I wrote that essay and I was starting to build what ended up being a collection of essays, my mentor was like, if you resonate so deeply with the song and you can't imagine another title, like don't force a new title on this, because for me it was really important. I also at one point in my life had a stick and poke tattoo that I gave myself of Keep Your Head Up, because this song title is so important to me. And then from there she gave me the guidance, my mentor, to build the collection around that, and what would it look like to give a nod to my DJ roots and my love of music. And so I ended up picking other essays and then writing other essays and picking different song titles for those based on sometimes the song coming into the essay, sometimes the song adding another layer of interpretation of that time, and then also sometimes being an actual soundtrack that I think of when I was at in that time of my life, particularly Heartbreak Hotel, which is by Whitney Houston, which my mom played a lot when she was separating from my dad. And so there's a variety of reasons why they're in there, but I think they all add another layer, hopefully, to the meaning of the essays.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to your truth, right? I mean, you're a DJ and you connect with music, so I totally understand. And I want to talk a little bit about the after your intro, the first essay is actually about your dad, which you just mentioned. And I wanted to kind of query about that. Why did you decide to start there with that relationship?
Yeah, so when I was writing all the different essays, they were coming to me at different times. And there's a lot of pressure on writers in general to focus in on one particular theme, maybe two themes. But when I was looking at the collection as it was starting to organically build, I had some that were about racism, some that were about family, some more about mental health, surviving sexual assault. And although if I was, to try to shop this to a big publisher, I might get the feedback that like there's too much going on. We're not allowed to be multi-layered, intersectional humans in the publishing world, and also in society sometimes. I didn't have that constraint when I was creating this project. And so what made sense to me as far as ordering it was to look at it chronologically. And so the collection starts with this distinct memory at about 5 or 6 when I'm in kindergarten. And from there, I had to actually create a table in Microsoft Excel so that I could pinpoint different ages, because it was kind of hard to figure out. And in the first version, which is this DIY version that I made in that community workshop, some of the essays are actually in slightly different order, because I realized in editing and revising in the next version, expanded version for future tense, that I had gotten some of the ages wrong. And that was just sort of the first memory that I think about a lot as being a moment when something changed. And in that moment, that particular essay is about, showing up essentially as a father and what that means. And I don't want to give away too much about it, but that is sort of what I see as sometimes the beginnings of some of the crumbling of my relationship with my dad, although it has ebbed and flowed a lot over the years.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, has your dad read the book? Does he know about the book? What does he think about the book?
Yeah, so my dad does know about the book. He didn't know about, I think, the first version because it was, again, just a small run that I made for friends primarily. And we've talked about it, and we hadn't actually talked in about 2 years when I had my phone call with my dad right around the time my book came out. But he was supportive ultimately of my writing the book, and also giving me permission to write what I want about how, I experience life. And at the same time, right now has a boundary for himself that he doesn't want to read the book, which at first I was like, that's kind of heartbreaking to hear that he doesn't want to read it. But at the same time, there are things in there that I write very honestly about, like sex, for example, that I don't necessarily want my dad to read. So it's okay at the end.
Totally, yeah. And you just mentioned how it is a very honest book. Your book is heavy in a lot of ways, because like you mentioned, it's very multifaceted, and it's super vulnerable. And I actually feel like I know you from reading this book. That's the way this book is kind of, just framed in a lot of ways. I feel like I know you in this deeper level. Was it hard for you to tap into these emotions?
Yeah, definitely at times. You know, what I suggest to a lot of people who want to write memoir is to have the support of a therapist or mental health provider, especially if you're trying to sort of dig deep and excavate and try to figure out what is the bigger meaning of these memories that you've had. And there's a lot of revisiting and also just sort of immersing yourself into particular places. On top of that, because my book progresses chronologically, and I also made the decision to have the voice progress as the main character, myself, ages, there was another layer of really trying to dig into what was I thinking at that time? What would I have said about my experience at that time, as opposed to having too heavy of like an adult filter sort of looking back. That was really painful. I mean, even writing about, you know, the first time that I experienced sort of like blatant racism, adult me can understand like these children are byproducts of their environments. They are maybe regurgitating information that they've heard about brown people from their families. They aren't necessarily like bad or evil. But if I add that layer, it sort of lessens the impact of that. And so in that particular essay where I talk about that experience, I wanted to remember what it was like more so for me to have experienced that and like the pain of that, because it did impact my life a lot at that moment. And I didn't want to warp it too much with adult perspective.
Yeah. And now that you mentioned that, I'm actually, going back and thinking through when I did the first read. So does your voice change throughout each chapter? Do you feel like as you progress through age, is that what you mean? By like
Yeah.
filtering through an adult kind of lens? Okay, cool. And so writing this book, what did that symbolize for you? Or what did that mean for you to finally kind of get all these things out there?
Well, I think one of the main things was that I felt like a lot of these stories and essays just sort of needed to be written and get out of my head and help me sometimes also boil down like what did this actually mean for me. It gives you a lot of time to reflect and consider what the impact actually was of those memories. And for me, writing has always been first and foremost therapeutic, actually. I talk about it in the introduction of the book, but my sister actually gifted me a beautiful hardcover diary when I was 13 years old. And we didn't have a good relationship really a lot growing up. We fought a lot. But this was one moment where she gave me something that was very helpful and beneficial. And there is this expelling for me that happens when I write something down. Even in the mornings, if I am just writing my anxieties out, it makes me feel more put together in my life if I can get those out. And so, what I think happened with this book is that this became my first book, but I've actually been writing a book for a long time. There's a book that will now be my second book that I'm still working on. And I feel like getting these out help make space for what this second book needs to be, because I think that a lot of these were sort of gnawing at me and needed to get out first before I could really tackle this other book that I'm working on. And I think will inform my next book a lot and has helped me be prepared in a variety of ways for writing that next book.
Totally. And it's interesting that you bring up all those things because I'm also a writer and I see a lot of myself in your book, which is always cool because it's not often that happens for Latinas or, people who live in the in-between. So as a writer, I feel a lot of fear when writing things that are maybe vulnerable and that writing requires some kind of honesty, right? With yourself or with your audience or whatever. And sometimes being honest is scary. So I'm curious for you, if you went up against any fear, and if you did, how did you overcome it, and where did that fear stem from?
For sure, yeah. I part of what really helped me get through what I think of like the voice of my inner self-critic, whether that's a voice that's telling me that my writing is bad or that no one wants to read my stories or that they aren't worthy, or any other variety of negative things that we can say to ourselves, especially when we are being vulnerable. Writing is vulnerable. Any sort of creative art is vulnerable because you have to surrender in some way, right? You don't know exactly what's going to happen in a way that other things that are more logical in life can feel a lot safer. And so there is always a vulnerability, even if it isn't bearing your soul and writing about your deepest, darkest secrets. So I just want to like make space for other forms of art also being very vulnerable. But one of the things that I do is just I notice that voice. And with this book, especially because I started with a really supportive community environment, I didn't know that it was going to become a book. I didn't have as heavy of a layer of worry built into it. And even when it was picked up by Future Tense Books, my inner critic kicked in and was like, no one's going to read it. It's fine. And so that actually gave me a lot of freedom to just go where I wanted to go. I also think about what do I enjoy reading? And 13-year-old me, but also current me, loves reading books, especially memoirs that feel very honest, that are complex and paint not only sort of like the realizations and the positive narrative arc, but also the messiness and the not great thoughts and some of the things that we do. Like I mentioned briefly in an essay that I like stuck a band-aid in someone's hair when I was 10, or it's just like being honest in that way. I think can feel really empowering because it's like when you don't have as many secrets bearing you down, you feel lighter. So what has helped me is just noticing the voice, and it still comes up, and just sort of like arguing back and just being like, it's fine. And my best secret, which is not a secret because I've shared it a lot, but my best tip is for myself to just pretend no one is ever going to read it, because that's actually the space where I feel the most free, because I don't have to worry about who's going to read it. I can make that decision later. And as a writer, you can always make that decision later. It doesn't have to be in the moment. And just pretending that no one will read it is helpful, I think.
I love that. I actually feel like I have never thought about thinking that. You
Yeah,
just mentioned
move your
13-year-old Emily.
decision. Sorry.
You just mentioned 13-year-old Emily. You mentioned her in your intro, and I want to know, I imagine you had to tap into 13-year-old you to write this, but what do you think 13-year-old you would, if you were to travel back in time and you were like, grabbed yourself by the shoulders and told her, dude, I'm going to write a book someday. Like, what do you think 13-year-old you would think about this book?
I think 13-year-old me would have a lot of doubts that I could write the book. I think that I would be really excited at the idea, but also just probably overwhelmed. And
What would you want her to feel?
what would I want her to feel? I mean, I'd want her to feel excited and empowered and know that there were greener pastures, for lack of a better word. I think that at that time, I didn't have a lot of spaces where I had hope, and it would have been incredibly hopeful to know that I could write a book one day and that I was capable and smart, and that I could also do something like this in a way that felt authentic, or what I talk about in my book is real. I was obsessed with things being real. And I'm like, I felt like I did what I would have wanted to set out to do, which was to write a book that was very real to my experience.
Yeah, you actually, there's a part in, I think when you're in middle school, you mentioned, I'm not going to give too much away, but you mentioned how, or it says how like things felt fake. And that really stuck out to me because I think for a lot of in-betweeners or Chicanos or people who live multicultural lives, things can feel fake or feel just off.
Mm-hmm.
Where do have you, like, where do you think that comes from? And do you feel like you've overcome that? Can we ever overcome this feeling of fakeness sometimes?
Yeah, I think what was really, really helpful to me, which I didn't really write about in the book, but I will write probably something about it in the next book. The next book that I am writing will be more about my hospitalization with bipolar disorder and looking at sort of like what my life was like before and what was it like after that happened. But I ended up going to an alternative high school program when I was a junior because I was struggling a lot. I talk about this in my book. I almost failed 8th grade. I like had detention all the time in middle school, and I got suspended in middle school and high school. And I felt like going in this sort of cycle and circle of just wanting to do well, but then not being able to. And in my alternative high school program, I just went to a community college instead, and took also some classes with high school students, which I thought I wouldn't like or do well at because I was struggling with regular high school. So I was like, how could I do community college? But it turned out that being able to pick my schedule and like have autonomy in what I was learning was really exciting. And the one class that I felt like was the answer to my why does everything feel fake, but somehow, like, I don't know where to pinpoint it, but I took sociology 101 when I was in junior year of high school. And I think that that should be a required curriculum for kids because I learned about things like social norms and how they're different in different cultures, and how even like growing up Catholic, there was like very specific rules that were taught about purity, for example, and sexuality. Um, and understanding that those were sort of like luck of the draw for better or worse. Like, had I been born into a different family or in a different time or in a different place, those rules would be different. And that was really empowering because when I had a name for what I saw as fakeness of like this pressure to be the perfect student who was like a cheerleader and was in a sorority one day and, had the perfect nuclear family, understanding that that was a societal rule that I could break was super empowering. So I think that that's where I was able to put a name again to what this idea of fakeness was. And I think that we can combat it at least. I don't know that we can shift, mainstream norms and culture, but I think that knowing that you get to live your life how you want to live it can help with that. And I know that it'll be a continual process for me because I continue to live in a society that, like, for example, is capitalist and tells us that we need to have the perfect home and like make all this money. And so we're just constantly bombarded with messages. And I think that even through adulthood, you're going to struggle with like, where do I actually fit in with this? And do I actually believe this belief?
Interesting. I think that makes me think of a follow-up question. There's a lot of elements of survival in this book. I don't think it's very much like you talk about survival, but I see it as I go through reading it, whether it's you're kind of you just mentioned it too, like we're constantly going through the cycle of like figuring out where are we or who are we. And you have so many rebirths in this book. You talk about your punk phase in middle school, which high five to that because I also had a little punk phase. You talk about going back to being normal and all that. So, in regards to survival, or being perfect, how has that impacted you today?
So sorry, your question is like, how did my maybe
Experiences of rebirth and all these things either help you today or not help you, or how do you think about it nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really grateful to my younger self for being so into experimenting. And I literally would sometimes look up like different subcultures on the internet and be like, what do they wear, what do they listen to? And it was like a research project that I did for myself. And the reason I did it was because I was trying to find the place where I felt most comfortable, where I felt like I didn't feel like this sort of outsider. And of course, within a subculture, it's like outside of mainstream anyways. But I was like, if I'm never going to fit in this mainstream, maybe there is a little group that I can find that will accept me for who I am. And there was obviously some sort of alchemy and shifting of myself to try to fit into those boxes. And I feel, again, grateful to have been interested in exploring and learning about different groups of folks. And ultimately, I feel like I'm just a big jumble of all those things. And I don't worry as much about being like, what am I? And I think that maybe that's also part of growing up, hopefully for some of us, that we can just know that like we are who we are, and we can be, again, sort of like multi-layered humans, multifaceted with a lot of different interests, and we don't have to be in a particular category.
Totally, totally. I'm really excited to talk to you about this next topic. What is your outlook on love? You have these really, really passionate essays, whether it's, no spoilers, but just your relationships throughout time, whether it's, in Mexico, or in high school or in middle school when, I think you mentioned kids just not being nice and things like that. But like nowadays, you're an older, you're older now. What's your experience with love, and what's your outlook on it?
With love?
With love. Yeah.
Oh. Well, I think I had to spend a lot of time in my early 20s learning how to be alone and be with myself, which to me comes back to this idea of self-love. And there was a lot of different tactics that I employed to try to make myself love myself. And part of it, like I mentioned, was therapy. I also took a lot of solo trips, and I recommend that people do that if they have the means, but where I was just sort of alone with myself. And that was a way that I got to spend time with myself and know myself. I like to reflect a lot. And with familial love and platonic love, I mean, there's a lot of different arenas where I love a lot of people, but I think I'm just ultimately like very open and want to love as many people as I can in my life. I have a partner, and we have a dog and a home together, and so I'm really lucky in that regard. But I just want to surround myself with folks who uplift me, inspire me, and like I can also do the same for them.
Totally. You just reminded me, what does your family think about the book? Has your family read the book? You talk so much about your family. I think it's amazing, the way you approach your family. I think, because families are also very complex, right? Particularly how you've already talked about your relationship with your dad, but I mean, in terms of family, have they read the book, and how do they feel about it?
Yeah, my family's been really supportive for the most part. My mom and like my immediate family, I have a lot of siblings. They've all been really supportive and have come out to different events. My mom and a couple of siblings and my grandma on my mom's side flew up or they drove up actually, but from the Bay Area to celebrate my book launch during this like small sliver of the summer when we thought that COVID was going to be over soon. So it was really nice to see them and have them be there and celebrate with me. And I have also had some family members who have had a lot of questions about the book. And they've sparked ultimately conversations that center around like who has the right to tell certain stories, and like why do we tell them in certain ways. And it's been hard, but it's been a practice for me in really getting down to being able to explain what my intent was, and also making peace with the fact that like sometimes my intention and someone else's response and sort of how I feel about it aren't going to be an exact concert, but that's also okay, and just trying to like hear each other out. And one of the things too, like I come from people who didn't have a lot of education access, whether they were in like Mexico or my parents, both of them dropped out of high school. And for some family members, I've had to just really walk them through like, this is a memoir. It is based on my truth and my perspective, but it isn't like a biography or like something that's rooted in like facts entirely, because we think about like eyewitness reports and we're kind of unreliable, right? Memory's unreliable. And also, I think explaining that because it's my story and it's focused on me, a lot of times I'm not going to be able to capture the breadth of my relationship with people in a particular essay because that's not the theme of the essay, for example. So it's been difficult, but I ultimately think it's been good in that it's sparked conversations that otherwise maybe historically we would just not talk about them, and they would become gossip and rumors and be sort of like under everyone's thoughts. And so it's doing the work it's supposed to do, even if it's not always like the easiest. And that's why one of the themes also of the book, I talk about it, is this idea of metamorphosis, even though it's something that is, talked about a lot and can be considered a cliche. The metamorphosis of butterflies, it's actually a really painful process, and it takes a long time, and it can hurt physically, right? And I think about that a lot as people, and the things that we go through sometimes can be very difficult and painful, but hopefully we come through on the other side like beautiful butterflies. And I think about Michoacan and the migration of the monarcas, and that's why, for me, even though maybe it's a cliche, it's not, because it's part of my culture and what comes through the region of Michoacan where my family's from.
Totally. And you just mentioned your culture. I'm curious, did you look back a lot on your own culture, on your own upbringing? Have you made any kind of, own metamorphoses now that you've written this book?
Yeah, I've written about, and there's an essay that talks about actually taking an ancestry DNA test, and how ultimately I just sort of ended up with more questions and had a lot of more sort of like identity crises spur from that. I've had a lot of time to sit with that particular original DNA result, which is also interesting because they'll send you updates every few years and be like, actually, this is what we know now based on more data sets. And so I'm still interested in digging into more of my ancestors' stories and learning more about where my family comes from, particularly in regards to the indigenous side of our culture that has been largely lost. I know that one of my grandmas, I think my grandma's grandma, so she spoke an indigenous language, but she can't remember which one. And I'm just sort of more curious still to continue to look through that and to try not to let colonization do what it's been doing and erasing that part. So it is an ongoing exploration, and I look forward to learning more about it as time goes on.
Totally. And you've been journaling your whole life. I think we're going to start seeing questions here soon. But you've been journaling your whole life, from what I take. And, you clearly, you went through your diaries and all that for this book. What was that like? What was that process of kind of looking back and seeing the way you used to write?
Yeah, so I've definitely journaled like on and off for most of my life. And I think what was when I first like rediscovered my diary from when I was 13, it was pretty funny just to see like the way that I talked. And that's why in my particular middle school essays, I tried to like have that same sort of like sassy attitude, but I just really tore into people. And it was like a space where I vented, and I was really surprised by how just like my like authentic voice was coming through to myself. It makes me laugh, and it's also very painful sometimes when I see some of the relationships that I had with people, especially boys, that didn't treat me well, and I just like didn't know what relationships look like or how I was supposed to be treated in partnership with other people. And I also try to channel that like openness in my own writing still, even though our tone of voice has changed a lot and like the way that I speak has changed a lot. I think it still has been a part of informing my voice today.
And we have a question from Donna Miscolta. Hi, Donna. Donna's also an author, actually. She says, Emily, when you were writing the book, you told yourself that nobody will read it, to free yourself in the writing. Once you were in the publishing and book promotion process, how did you define your audience? Who do you especially want to read your book?
Yeah, when I was thinking about who I was writing the book towards, this was actually really helpful in when I was going from like, again, that DIY version I made to actually publishing the book and looking to expand it, and where that inner self critic started to come up more again, I thought about, well, okay, who is this for? This isn't going to be for everybody. And I thought about my 13-year-old self and what she would want to read, because that's ultimately who I felt like I was writing it to. And so I think like my primary audience is 13-year-old me. And like that is for like young, lost, maybe Latinas or brown girls in white places. And then I think sort of more broadly, other people I'm sure can connect to it. I think anyone who has ever felt like they were outside or marginalized, or has maybe experienced, whether it's like mental health issues or sexual assault, or this sort of like fracturing of family. There's a lot of other people that I think the book can connect to and resonate with. But first and foremost, I was writing it, thinking about writing it to 13-year-old me.
Mhm. Totally. And is that, in thinking of 13-year-old self, is that how you decided which life events you would write about? I mean, you mentioned it's in chronological order, and reading it, I'm like, wow, there's got to be way more here. Like, I just wanted more. I was like, you mentioned details, and I was like, wait, I want to know more about that too. But yeah, how did you decide what exactly you would write about?
I started with just memories. And in the writing workshop that we'll do in a few minutes, actually, we're going to do an exercise that is one of my favorites, which is listing sort of different memories, essentially. Well, I won't give away too much because it has to be spontaneous when we do it.
Totally, totally
But
understand.
yeah, it came with looking at memories, primarily just that I didn't really know sometimes what they meant, or what the deeper meaning of them was besides just them happening. And so that was part of it. And then also part of it, when I was forming a collection, was looking at where are the gaps of age and where are the gaps in topic. So the final essay I wrote was actually the essay in this version of the book that you all have or have access to, about my eating disorder. And that was not in previous iterations, but I felt like when I was talking about Funeral for Flaca and telling that story, I really had to go into that topic, in order for the reader to understand the significance of Flaca beyond the relationship with my dad, which was present. And so there was like this other layer. So it was a combination of looking at age and topic, and then starting with the memories first and foremost.
Mhm. And are there any things that you left out of the book that, just couldn't make it?
So many. Yeah, there's a lot of different
How
topics.
many books can we expect in the future?
I have at least a few in me, I would say. But yeah, I mean, the next book that I'm working on, like I mentioned, was this first book, and it's going to be, as long or longer as this current book, and the time span will be much shorter. So it'll be from when I'm like 16 through probably 21. And so thinking about this book being from 5 to 29, there's just like a lot more that I'll dive into in those years in my next book.
Mhm.
So yeah, some of which is what it was like to be hospitalized with bipolar disorder, but not just that, but like after, and what it was like to have a diagnosis and what decisions I needed to make about my life given the information, and yeah, how hard it was honestly to make some of those choices.
Totally. Is there like, if you could, you know, boil it down, which I know is never easy to do. And obviously I wouldn't want you to do that, but if you could just bring it down to like a message or a lesson that you want all the homegirls who might read this book to get from Funeral for Flaca, what would it be?
Um, I'd say that even though a lot of us have to go through hardships and trauma and things that are really difficult, that there are things on the other side. And I know that especially growing up and childhood can be really hard, and teenagerdom can be super hard. But I just want to tell little Emily's or girls like Emily, that there are things beyond school that will provide you comfort, and community is really important. And also learning to be in touch with yourself more and healing yourself, as a continual process. But therapy is really helpful for that.
Totally. Well, thank you so much, Emily. I am super excited to just, see more of your writing, see more of your books. I'm really looking forward to it. I really loved your book. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Just thank you for your time again, and thanks for everyone else. And for folks who haven't signed up, you can join the writing workshop. I think they can drop a link. But otherwise, my email or my website is there with my email if you want to talk. But more information there. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you both. What an incredible talk, and Agueda and Emily. It's been a pleasure. You've both been engaging, and you're welcome to come back anytime.